Thank you for all coming today. I especially want to thank John Downing and Laura German and the Center for Global Media Research for making it possible not only to come here today, but also to attend the conference, the National Conference on Media Reform in Memphis, which has just finished, in which many of the panelists have been, which I think one can make critiques of aspects of it, but I think overall it's a tremendously inspiring event, and I look forward to your views on it as well. So what I'm going to talk about today is the building of media reform movements, which I see media reform as a kind of subset of a broader field, if you like, of media democratization. And John asked me to talk and focus specifically or particularly on Canadian media activism, and I will do that to some extent, but I think it would be a little depressing just to focus on Canada at the moment. For reasons we can get into, but so I want to put it in a broader context, drawing partly from the book that John just mentioned, Remaking Media. And before I forget, I have an extra copy for your library, for the center or the college. I will leave this here for anybody who's interested in following up. The questions that are addressed in this book, I can give you about 10 or so questions that we tried to deal with, looking at democratic media activism as a potential social movement. First question is, what do we mean by the media's democratic deficit? Okay, we've introduced this idea that the media have a democratic deficit. That's a concept used in political discourse to imply that democratic institutions are not, in terms of their structures or their practices, not fully meeting the democratic expectations that are placed on them. That's sometimes even used in Canadian political discourse, even by our previous Prime Minister, Paul Martin, who spoke about a democratic deficit in our parliamentary system. And he had very limited reforms in mind, things like having a more representative Senate, for example. We don't have an elected Senate in Canada. It's appointed. So he was going to tinker with that. But what we have in mind by the media's democratic deficit is something much broader. And what we did was we took about 8 or so themes. We identified about 8 themes in the critical media scholarship that taken together, we argue, constitutes a significant democratic deficit that has all kinds of consequences for social movements, for policy outcomes, and ultimately, for alternative futures for our species. I think that's ultimately, in part, that's ultimately what's at stake, and the media play a role in making some futures more likely and others less likely. So the themes we identified included the media's public sphere failure, the centralization of power, the reinforcement of inequality, the homogenization of discourse, the undermining of community, corporate enclosure of intellectual property, so-called intellectual property, elitist and secretive policymaking with regard to communications, and the erosion of privacy and free expression rights, particularly since 9/11, particularly in cyberspace. So grant you that's a rather, some of you teach journalism, I know, that's not the whole picture. Media do positive things in democracy as well, but we think that taken together, those risks, those dangers, and those tendencies constitute a democratic deficit that can ultimately be addressed only by strong social movements or strong social pressure. Okay? So that's one theme we explore. That's sort of a starting point for the book. Okay, so the media have a democratic deficit, and I've contributed to identifying that deficit over 15 years of work as a media critic, a content analyst, a media monitor. I co-founded a project in Canada called Newswatch Canada, which was based on Project Censored here in the States. How many people are familiar with Project Censored? About a third of you? Basically what they do is identify the top 25 or so stories each year that the dominant corporate media missed. Very significant stories, right? That are published in smaller or alternative, so-called alternative papers that didn't get significant coverage, anything proportionate to their public importance. So we set up a project in 1993, and over the next 10 years did research. We published a book called The Missing News, Blind Spots and Filters in Canada's Press. But over time, you get to feel that, you know, we've done this before. These criticisms have been made, you know, year after year. What are we actually going to do about it to change it, to diversify and democratize the media system? So that's what got me into the project over the last 5 years that led to this book that was based on interviews with about 150 media activists and journalists and others in Britain, Canada, and the United States to look at this emerging field of contestation, the question of how do you change the media themselves rather than simply use or try to use the media for other political messages. In other words, how do you make the media themselves a political issue? So the other questions we address in this book then are, how are the media related to the fields of economic and political power? And here we dabble a little bit in Pierre Bourdieu's notion of institutional fields, each with their own relative autonomy, their own logics, their own characteristics. What can social movement theory tell us about democratic media activism? Can we map out a typology of media activism in relation to Habermas's distinction between the life world, or civil society, if you will, and the system of the state and if you like, corporate power, very crudely speaking. So you can already see we're being very theoretically eclectic if we're drawing on Bourdieu and Habermas, and also neo-hegemony theory and others. We try not to overwhelm you with theory. We're just, you know, we just went into the intellectual attic and just pulled out what we needed, okay, to make an analysis. Another question is media reform coalitions, who are its potential constituents and allies? What are the political commitments of media activism? What are the contending frames? Like, how would you describe it in a nutshell? What is democratic media about? What's the key idea? And I do have a slide on that if we want to look at it later. How does North American contemporary media activism compare in historical and ideological context with other struggles that have taken place at other times and places? We offer case studies of two of the, what I would see as two of the most important media democratization groups in the Anglo-American North Atlantic. Our focus, I should say, is quite consciously on those three countries, Canada, the US, and Britain, not because I hope we are sort of Western chauvinists or that we are not arguing that whatever holds true in these countries is true for the rest of the world. John Downing, as much as anybody, has warned us of the dangers of Western centricism in media theory. But what we are arguing is that the North Atlantic is the heartland of globalized neoliberalism, and that political and economic and cultural struggles there have global significance, right? As indeed the reverse is the case also. But media based in those countries still have tremendous influence around the world, and the policies pursued by the governments of those countries are obviously still helping set the terms of debate and the direction of policies governing international trade, environmental protection, cultural sovereignty, and much else. What are the main challenges and obstacles for media activism? Because media activism in those countries, you know, if the governments and policies of those countries are a problem, then obviously at some level you have to engage in political struggle, which entails a struggle by and through the media. So what are challenges and obstacles for media activism to transform the media system? What are the main resources and springboards for activism? What's the relationship between media activism and other social movements? And how does the media field, the institutional sphere of dominant media industries, shape media activism? Okay, so those are more questions that we could adequately answer in the 200 pages, so I'm not even going to attempt that today. But I do want to comment on a couple of them. Okay, the last two questions there about the media field and the relationship of media activism to other movements. We think, this is one of our conclusions, that media activism is not likely to resemble other social movements. It has, it seems, even with this conference, by and large, I think it has less of a collective identity when you compare it with other movements like environmentalism, ethnic or minority rights, gay rights, feminism, and I think there's reasons for that that I'll get to in a moment. It has less of a collective identity, as you know, people don't go around defining themselves as media Democrats or media reformers, I think, in the same deeply felt sense that they might call themselves an environmentalist. Okay? We also think that media activism is less likely to comprise a social movement in and for itself than to constitute a kind of nexus between other movements, many of them pre-existing movements. Okay? So why is that? And I think the nature of the media field itself helps explain why that is the case. We can point to three characteristics of the media, the institutions of the media. One is that the media field is weak in the sense that its autonomy is relatively weak. It's vulnerable to influence from the political and economic fields, if you will, the field of power, so that power is exerted through the media. Okay. Yet, on the other hand, a second characteristic is that the media field has a high capacity to intrude upon other fields. Right? It's obviously shaped the way politics gets done. And here we can talk about power of the media. And thirdly, the boundaries of the media field are rather permeable and often difficult to differentiate from other fields, like other forms of cultural production, sports and entertainment, politics, and so on. So that suggests that the media's democratic deficit cannot be disembedded from other political and economic issues, and that media activism cannot be easily detached from other social movements. The field's permeable boundaries and its ability to intrude in other fields have made media activism especially dependent on the ebbs and flows of other broader political tides. But they've also given media reformers a capacity to conscientize, as it were, to help shape agendas and raise awareness on the part of other social movements in recognizing the media field as a new site of struggle, right? Characteristic of, if you like, late modernity. We also think that the field's porosity, its permeability, its lack of a very distinct separate institutional location contributes to media activism's secondary character compared to other movements. As I've already mentioned, a lot of activists identify mainly with ecology or anti-capitalism or other movements and only see themselves secondarily as media activists. And yet the high capacity of media to intrude on other fields helps explain why so many movements now recognize media as a necessary site of struggle, right? Because media is important to other struggles. It's hard to imagine an environmentally sustainable world when you have a media system that is constantly promoting overconsumption on the part of the wealthy nations of the North, for example. So this suggests that the nexus-like character of media activism, its ability to bring together in a web-like way other movements, is inscribed within the media field itself because of those characteristics. I want to add a bit more about the inchoate character of media activism, that there are obstacles peculiar to the media field and the project of media democratization that are distinct from those facing other social movements. So one is that, as I've already mentioned, media activism lacks a clear collective identity. And at first sight, that seems a bit counterintuitive, because if communications actually helps constitute contemporary capitalism, why have those struggling against the injustices of capitalism not identified media as a distinct site of struggle until relatively recently, right? And developed a movement to change the media. I think part of the explanation for why other movements haven't until recently identified media as a site of struggle is a kind of residue from the old left's, if you like, the old left's totalizing critique of capitalism. In fact, we're talking about classical Marxism and its European offshoots and so on, that basically paid little attention to the media except as a presumed superstructure, something that was simply an afterthought to relations of power and politics that lay elsewhere, right? There was an assumption, I think, for years in left politics that if you fixed the economy, if you gained political power, took over state power, that you didn't have to worry about the media particularly. They would follow suit. I think one of the consequences of that, in the United States at least, is that whatever media reform activism took place in the US for years was relegated to liberals, right, middle-class liberals, who did not connect media reform to the broader contours of the social order, and thus failed to inspire mass support. They weren't linked to other social movements, in other words. And amongst the new social movements themselves, you know, feminism, environmentalism, and so on, the tendency has been, or had been, to use media strategies that strived for sympathetic coverage within the media, or to produce alternative media that would reduce their dependence on the dominant media, right? Rather than to identify the dominant media as a problem for, you know, democratic renewal that needed addressing and changing in and of themselves. Another problem with, or an obstacle for media reform activism, I think, is low issue salience, right? One of my colleagues in Canada said that, you know, those of us who gather in meetings like this are freaks, right? Because 99% of the population is not thinking about the media as an issue. And even with 3,000 people in Memphis, you know, it's growing, but it's still obviously, at this point, a small minority of people who see it as a political issue. I think that is changing, but the media's democratic deficit is a process issue, right? It's one that doesn't threaten material interests strongly and directly enough to inspire a primary, if you like, old-style movement similar to labor. And neither does it evoke identities distinct from other new social movements. A third issue is that media reform faces a particularly strong free rider problem, that the costs of mobilizing are disproportionately borne by heavily engaged media activists, you know, the kinds of folks we saw in Memphis, right? While the benefits of media reform would be very broadly diffused and shared, presumably they would benefit most progressive social movements as well as citizens in general, whether or not they've contributed to the success of media reform. Right? So locally, there's a free rider problem, as economists would put it, and that's been imported into some brands of social movement theory, the idea that you need to mobilize existing resources and you need to take into account what's rational for social actors to do or not to do. Economically speaking, and I realize it's only one perspective, but in a sense it doesn't make sense to engage in media activism in the sense that the benefits for your efforts are not going to be anything like proportionate to the effort you have to put into it. And of course, if all groups embrace that kind of local rationality, that self-interested rationality, then media activism is hardly ever going to get done. Although I suppose you could say the same about some other social movements as well, like the environmentalism as well. But we would argue that the benefits to media reform are less obvious even than the benefits to fixing up the environment. Yeah? So we think that the free rider problem is especially a challenge for media activism. Another barrier, of course, is posed by media reform's target. It's a system which specializes in the formation of consciousness, right? So if you think of the environmental movement, pollution is something that's visible. You know, there's toxic sludge, and the PR industry isn't totally successful in convincing you that toxic sludge is good for you, right? To take the title of one of the books, criticizing the PR industry. It's visible, it affects your body, whereas the media, I mean, whatever impact, social and political impact they have, is often much more subtle and arguably seduces the mind, right? So that people can end up buying into and even identifying with the branded images and the television characters and so on of the corporate mediascape. And a fifth problem, and I find this sometimes with students, tell me how you think about it, is the sense of communicative empowerment that some potential stakeholders in media reform derive from new information technologies. If you've got your iPod, if you can throw up your own website, what's the problem? Right? If you're thinking in those relatively narrow terms of self-expression rather than the broader way in which the world is wired. So those are definite challenges for democratic media activism, and I think they help explain why, as a movement, it's relatively slow to coalesce and emerge. And yet I think that it will emerge and is emerging, at least in the United States, far more than in Canada, which I'll turn to in a minute. One theoretical consideration that my colleague, Bill Carroll in particular, points to is that media activism arise at the seam between the system and the life world. And he argues that oppositional movements typically arise when you have the contradictory logics of the everyday life world, dominated by a logic of dialogue, versus that of the system, dominated by bureaucratic and economic rationality, profit and power, in other words. And the media and media activism really are very much at that intersection. Yeah? The media are part of our everyday life world. There's small-scale media that we use in our day-to-day lives. We even make media, the websites and so on. But they're also very much part of a state-regulated and corporate-dominated system. So that helps, I think, underline the importance of the media field as a pivotal site for broader political and cultural struggles. And my last comment is in terms of, and we say it near the end of the book, is that we need research, more research that looks at the vectors. Where does the energy come for media democratization? What specific paths are most fruitful, and under what conditions is media activism likely to succeed in actually transforming parts, at least, of the system? And we argue that probably from our research, probably the strongest vector is from social movements to alternative media. I mean, social movements facing the frustration of achieving or pursuing political goals, but finding a kind of blockage in the media system. So they often create their own alternative media. They ally with independent media producers. They become media producers. And then in the third stage, they engage in policy activism related to communications policy, often because they're forced to. And I think the History of Media Alliance, which is, I think, is a tremendously impressive group in San Francisco area, illustrates that kind of evolution. The possibility, and they've shown it, you can get young people from Oakland who've grown up in poverty, get them involved in telling their own stories, producing their own media, and then ultimately in very militant and very inspiring ways engaging in policy issues to defend their existing media, to defend their right to a voice, and to start transforming the entire system. So that's the general comments I want to make. If we turn to Canada, probably the easiest way to do that is to sort of compare the Canadian situation with the American one. So I want to look briefly at the political and media fields in Canada compared with the US. In the political field, here in the States, so we argue that media activism is in some way conditioned by the broader contours of the American left, in which the intersection of class and race has had a profound influence. Questions of race and institutionalized racism in American society have not left the left unaffected, right? And I think it was evident at the Media Reform Conference that they're still struggling with that. I mean, I think they're making progress, but of course it's not for me as a middle-aged white guy to make that judgment, but I think they do seem to be making the effort at least to diversify in ethnic terms who's up on the stage. Whether that's been incorporated into organizational planning and to different frames or agendas is another question. But I think they're at least making the effort. But in the United States, questions of media diversity are often expressed in terms of ethnic and racial diversity, right, as well as gender. And that's, I think, less the case in Canada, where the politics, if you like, I'm not saying Canada does not also have institutionalized racism, but visible minorities are a much smaller proportion of the population. And so I don't think that race forms as much of an axis for media activism in Canada. Another difference is that in the United States, the left is more marginalized than it is in Canada. Here, labor unions, trade unions are, what can we call it? The dominant tradition is one of business unionism, right? Historically. Just looking after the strictly economic interests of your own members. No doubt the historical influence of McCarthyism, and even earlier than that, the Red Scare following World War I, has sort of drained the labor movement of potential radicalism and militancy, has made it more conservative here than in Canada, so that unions are not as present in the US as they are in Canada, even in struggles around media reform, for example. Right? And I don't know, maybe some of you, the others in the panel, can comment on who you saw being represented at the conference and who wasn't, who should have been there, but really wasn't in this, to the extent that one would hope. I also think in terms of the marginalization of the left, you know, the new left in the 1960s has a lot to do with that, that it was very much a countercultural movement. It adopted a politics of expressivism, as John Sanbonmatsu has put it, more concerned with, you know, demonstrating and expressing your anger and your outrage, rather than the careful and sometimes tedious process of forming political programs and building counter-hegemonic coalitions. So that there has arguably, I'm willing to hear from others on this, keen to hear from others on this, a self-marginalizing tendency in the American left, yeah? As well as a certain libertarian current, which is, you know, my right to do my own thing. That was a 60s slogan. I can actually remember that. You can see how long in tooth I am. You know, do your own thing. That might be the sort of essential idea of libertarianism. Has made, perhaps, the American left, for understandable reasons as well, reluctant to engage with state policy on, whether, you know, except in negative and oppositional ways. In Canada, somewhat by contrast, the left has a more institutionalized presence in the political system. There's for decades, there's been a political party. It's never won national power, but it has governed individual provinces, that is left of center. It used to be called the Cooperative Commonwealth Federation, going back to the 1930s, and in the 1960s, it reformed itself as the New Democratic Party, which is much like a European Social Democratic Party, for which there's no equivalent in the US, really. You also have, because of Canada's history and our location next to the giant of the United States, a different process of state formation and a somewhat different political culture, so that there are progressive spaces for cultural and media policy within the state itself. The state itself has created institutions that serve democratic purposes outside the market, most notably the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, the CBC, which is much stronger, you know, proportionately than PBS is in your country. We've got an institution like the National Film Board, which you know, is tax funded. Again, produced films that were supposed to serve public interest purposes, and there's a lot of debate about its relationship with the state, but nevertheless, it's something that is outside the market, and sometimes it's done quite radical films and projects. In the 1960s, for example, the NFB helped to sponsor social animation projects in which they would go into small towns in, let's say, rural Quebec, for example, and give people handheld cameras, which were new at the time, and invite them and encourage them to tell their own stories, you know, about poverty or about family life or whatever issues they thought were important. Remember, this is from the state. It's the government that was encouraging that kind of activity. There's also always been a concern in Canadian communications policy, something that you don't really have to worry about here, that is the idea of cultural sovereignty, of ensuring that there is space in the media system for the expression of communication between the different regions of Canada, as well as for values, you know, that we are assumed to hold in common, in face of the overwhelming presence of the USA and its, you know, Hollywood dream machine, which purely economic logic would dictate would simply, you know, swallow us up, basically. So there had to be a conscious policy if there's going to be an effectively Canadian media system at all. We've also in Canada had support for the arts, okay? Government support for the arts, I think, on a per capita greater basis than you have in the US. So I think for all those reasons, the left in Canada hasn't seen the media historically as a problem with the same speed and to the same extent that the left in the United States has come to see the media. There's also a bit more we can say about the media systems in Canada and in the United States. I would argue, and maybe correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems to me that American media tend to be either local, and I'm talking about mass media, right? Our book, focuses on the machinery of representation. So as John Downing rightly pointed out in a review of our book, we don't really deal much with the internet. What we do in places, but we're really focusing on what some activists told us is still the impetus for media activism, and that is the question of representation. So I think that the mass media, the conventional mass media in the United States, seem to be either local, based in individual cities, or national, like the networks, the TV networks in scope. In Canada, you have more regional divisions, both in the political system and the media system. We have 10 provinces, contrasted with your 50 states. So provinces, as a political unit, loom larger in our system than states do here. And in addition, of course, we have a binational character in a sense. And the Canadian government, interestingly, has just recognized the Quebecois as a distinct national people, and a distinct nation. There was quite a bit of controversy outside Parliament, but this has been something, you know, an enduring theme of Canadian history is the relation between English and French-speaking Canadians, the latter being concentrated in the province of Quebec. And so they've had additional concerns about cultural autonomy, cultural identity, and so on, and they've had quite active state, provincial government involvement in cultural policy, in building an infrastructure for Francophone, French language, cultural expression. It also means, so media activism tends to be, I think, compartmentalized to a greater extent than here within particular regions, unless it takes place at the national level, where even at the national level, you do have, you know, quite different realities for French and English-speaking Canadians. I already mentioned that we have a stronger tradition of public service broadcasting, whereas here, you know, all you have is PBS, right? And it's hard to imagine thousands of people going to the barricades to defend PBS as it's currently structured. But CBC does have a very significantly larger and committed core of supporters. And in fact, the largest media reform group in Canada, at least in English Canada, I don't claim to speak for the other nation of Quebec. It's, there are folks like Mark Raboy and others who study it much better than I do. But we have something which many, many Canadians feel is worth defending, and the largest media reform group is the Friends of Canadian Broadcasting, which has been quite active. It's got something like up to 100,000 donors per year. It's not a membership organization. It's a few people with a mailing list who do effective lobbying work to the broadcasting regulator, the CRTC, as well as Parliament. And they can raise typically, you know, $1 million a year, which is pretty large by the standards of Canadian nonprofit organizations. Whereas again, that means that in Canada we have a model that people feel is worth defending. I would argue that's one of the motivations, the easiest motivations for media activism, is when people value something that they feel they're about to lose, right? They see a threat. In fact, every fundraising letter I get is, right? Some of you get stuff in the mail, right? From direct mail pleas for your donations. Usually it's, you know, here's something you value, somebody's about to wipe it out, only we can stop it, send us money now. Isn't that basically what it comes down to? Just about nearly every fundraising letter you get, and yet it's fairly effective. In the United States, you don't really have a public service model, a visible one that matters to people's lives. You don't have one that's, you know, there to defend. It's hard to see what the alternative to hyper-commercialism could be, right? So the logic of commercialism, of advertising-based media, is much stronger in the US than it is in Canada, and there's no strong, visible alternative to it. And that may be, in a way, that helps to condition the nature, I think, of media activism in Canada, you know, around public service broadcasting. So let me conclude then just with a few thoughts on the actual, you know, nature of Canadian media activism. The main issues, I would say, in the last 10 years or so around media democracy and the democratic deficit would first of all concern media ownership. The level of concentration in Canada is actually much higher than it is in the United States, particularly in the press industry with which I'm most familiar. And in partly that's just sheer arithmetic, right? We're 1/10 the size in terms of population than the US is. So an economically viable company, right, is going to have a certain minimal size that just almost by definition, that's going to be a larger chunk of Canada's market than it is in the United States. We have 107 daily newspapers. There's about 1,700 in the US, right? So there's about 3 companies that account for a majority of both TV newscast, market share, and the press. CanWest Global, Bell Globe Communications, and Quebecor, and the sort of multimedia conglomerates. And some of the consequences that flow from that are, of course, cutbacks to journalism, to editorial resources, just as a byproduct of corporate rationalization. You know, when you have media mergers, they typically will try to rationalize their resources. So, Bill, you were telling me earlier, one example right here in the States is that the paper I believe you worked for once had 8, is that right? 8 legislative reporters. It now has 4. But that's something that happens often as a result of mergers. We've seen it in Canada, all over the country. But also there's concerns about political bias. And I should say that in Canada, the notion of a left liberal media, which I think is a myth, is there, but it's less strong than it is in the United States. And indeed, about 10 years ago, that nothing other than a threat to something you value, nothing can motivate activism than a good villain, right? So we had a great villain about 10 years ago, a fellow named Conrad Black. Now, has everybody heard of Conrad? Has anybody, yeah? Okay, so about in 1996, that's when he really became a major player in Canada's press system, when his Hollinger Incorporated bought up the once venerable Southern family, what was once a family-owned newspaper company, a chain of daily newspapers across the country called Southern. And suddenly, he was in a dominant position with something like 50% of English language circulation in the country, in one company. And not only that, but if you know Conrad Black, he has fairly strong opinions about things, right? And he was quite willing to use his newspapers, or was seen to be willing to use his newspapers to advance a right-wing agenda. So that led to the formation of a coalition which took the name Campaign for Press and Broadcasting Freedom, which it borrowed from a British group of the same name that's been around since 1979, and was quite active for about a year. A coalition of the largest progressive group in Canada called the Council of Canadians, with about 100,000 members, and media unions and progressive social advocacy groups and artist groups and so on. To challenge that takeover, they launched a court challenge on constitutional grounds, arguing that the takeover was ultimately a threat to Canadians' freedom of speech, which I think was never a strong argument legally, but some people saw it as a good publicizing and organizing tool. And it was tossed out of court, summarily, within about a year. And in fact, the Council of Canadians was required to pay Conrad Black $1,000 for court costs. Nevertheless, Conrad Black, continued to motivate concern and activism, and it made it easier to show Canadians what the problem was. I think that's a little harder to do now that he's gone. May not be sorely missed, but he's on to bigger and better things, it looks like jail. But it does illustrate that you need to somehow personify the problem and make it clear to ordinary people what's at stake, how media concentration might threaten their values or something that they hold dear. A second ownership-related issue is that of foreign ownership, which we now have a new conservative government, believes that in the free market, wants to deregulate, so-called deregulate as much as possible. In Canada, we've had foreign ownership restrictions in telecommunications, broadcasting, and through tax law in the newspaper industries. And those are now being reviewed. I mean, the tendency is now to start unraveling them, perhaps beginning with telecommunications. Right now, the Conservative government has a minority. There's 4 parties in Parliament. The Conservatives, at this point, cannot ram through whatever they want without the support of at least one opposition party. But it remains to be seen what will happen after the next election. We're likely to have an election within a few months. So the question of, will Canada's media industry suddenly be opened to an influx of foreign investment with, its implications for control? The other issues include possible strengthening of intellectual property rights through copyright. That's on the back burner right now, and that's, I'm sure you've discovered in the United States, a very difficult issue to explain. It's even difficult for us if you're not a specialist in the area. So it's hard to mobilize around. Cutbacks to CBC, that's an ongoing process over the last 20 years, which I've already mentioned, and you can mobilize around that, except if you've got incremental cutbacks, bit by bit. If there's nothing really dramatic happening, again, that's a difficulty, a challenge for mobilizing. And another issue I'd argue has to do with the practices of journalism in interaction with government. I would argue that we need to start paying more attention, at least in Canada we do, it's already a problem recognized here, the militarization of journalism, embedded reporting and so on, right? Canada's role in Afghanistan, we have a different history. We have a tradition, so-called, of peacekeeping, which many Canadians feel is being abandoned or even betrayed by the current government, which has committed the Canadian military to a fairly aggressive role in Afghanistan. And so far, 44 Canadian troops have died there, which on the scale of your war in Iraq is not a lot, but it is, I believe, the most since the Korean War, right? Canadian casualties, which was 50 years ago. And many of us have noticed a shift in the frames of Canadian coverage of the conflict. More human interest stories about the troops, more embedded journalism, literally, reporters traveling with the troops, less sort of analytical and critical coverage of the policy of being in Afghanistan. I don't think that's monolithically true, but I do think that it's an issue that's starting to attract attention. And the media are not a monolith. We always have to remember that, but it's a disturbing tendency, I think, in Canadian journalism that could be a basis for mobilization. So very briefly, I'll just conclude with a few more comments on English Canadian media activism. We have had some history of successful media reform movements in Canada in the past, most notably the one that Robert McChesney talks about in his book as a counterexample to the failed radio reform movement of the 1930s in the States, where you ended up with a hyper-commercialized media radio system rather than a public service one. In Canada, at about the same time, we were at least successful, or at least the reform movement was successful in creating a public broadcaster, the CBC, in the first place. And we've had a succession of government inquiries over the years, which, even though they've often had little impact on policy, at least call attention to issues of media diversity and the threat of media concentration, and the need to defend Canada's cultural sovereignty and the public service ethos in the media. Having said that, I have to admit that we're far from perfect. Canadian media activism is still somewhat fragmented. There's a disjuncture between alternative media, people who produce their own media, and media reform, those who engage with policy issues. But even there, I see some local success stories. Like I personally help organize an annual event in Vancouver called Media Democracy Day. That's been going for 5 or 6 years now, and typically gets 500 to 1,000 people each year. It helps that it's held in the public library with the support of local librarians. With educational institutions help sponsor it, trade unions, and independent media. We in fact have an annual independent media fair. So we've consciously worked for 5 years to try and bring media policy and independent media together. We've also, in Canada, more so than the United States, have had more union involvement and political party involvement in developing democratic media policies. It's unfortunate that the two main media workers' unions in English Canada hardly talk to each other as a result of bitter jurisdictional rivalries, but at least they are trying to popularize, or at least developing policy for a democratic media system. And likewise, from time to time, the New Democratic Party has picked up the issue, although again, I think they could be much more vocal about it. Nevertheless, I think some of the building blocks for a media reform movement are there in Canada. It is still, however, much more disjointed than it is evidently the case in the United States. Okay, there's nothing like the Memphis Conference happening in Canada yet. We'll see if we can change that. Okay, so thank you very much. I think I'll invite my colleagues.